December 1968. The Plain of Jars, Laos. The mist clinging to the limestone casts of northern Laos was thick enough to choke on. For the convoy of Soviet-manufactured ZIL-157 trucks rumbling through the dark, the visibility was near zero. This was the Ho Chi Minh Trail's western artery, a supposedly secure lifeline pumping weapons, ammunition, and fuel from North Vietnam to the communist forces fighting in the south. Inside the lead command vehicle, a Soviet military advisor sat in uncomfortable silence alongside a North Vietnamese army colonel. Technically, the Soviet Union was not fighting in this war. Technically, according to the Geneva Accords of 1962, no foreign troops were supposed to be in Laos at all. The country was officially neutral, but the map on the advisor's lap told a different story. The map showed a massive, unchecked flow of Soviet steel moving south to crush the Americans. The advisor checked his watch. It was 2 a.m. They were miles deep into territory controlled by the Pathet Lao, the local communist insurgency. This was supposed to be the rear guard, the safest place on the Indochina Peninsula. The Americans were tied down in the rice paddies of South Vietnam, and their ground troops were legally forbidden from crossing the Laotian border. Then, the impossible happened. It didn't start with the roar of a jet engine or the whistle of heavy artillery. It started with a sound that didn't belong in modern warfare, a sharp, distinct crack of a single rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls. The lead truck exploded. Within seconds, the jungle on both sides of the narrow dirt track erupted. Tracers tore through the canvas covers of the supply trucks. But the angle of fire was wrong. The shots were coming from above. Not from the tree line, but from the jagged, vertical peaks of the limestone mountains, terrain that was considered physically impossible for infantry to scale, let alone fight from. The North Vietnamese regulars, battle-hardened and disciplined, scrambled out of the burning vehicles. They shouted orders, raising their AK-47 rifles to return fire, but there was nothing to shoot at. The muzzle flashes from the cliffs were sporadic, appearing and vanishing like ghosts. This wasn't a conventional ambush, it was a turkey shoot. The Soviet advisor was thrown from his jeep by the blast of a mortar round. Ears ringing, he looked up at the black shapes of the mountains. He expected to see American Marines. He expected to see South Vietnamese Rangers. Instead, amidst the chaos and the burning gasoline, he saw figures moving along the ridgelines with the agility of mountain goats. They weren't wearing helmets, they weren't wearing uniforms. They were destroying a mechanized column of the North Vietnamese army, backed by the industrial might of the Soviet Union, using bolt-action rifles and tactics that seemed to date back to the 19th century. By the time the sun rose over the Plain of Jars, the convoy was a smoking ruin. The attackers had vanished into the mist, leaving no bodies and no tracks. The Soviet advisor stood among the wreckage of 12 trucks and 2 PT-76 amphibious tanks. He picked up a spent shell casing from the ground. It wasn't standard NATO issue. It was old. The report he radioed back to Hanoi, and which eventually found its way to a confused intelligence desk in Moscow, contained a single, terrifying question. Who stopped us? There were no American bases on the map. There were no runways capable of landing troop transports. And yet, an invisible wall had just slammed down in the middle of the jungle, halting the advance of global communism in its tracks. TTA. Before we dive deeper into the shadows of the Cold War, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We investigate the classified operations and secret histories that shaped our modern world. Hit the bell so you never miss a briefing. End CTA. The confusion in Hanoi was palpable. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu, was not a man easily rattled. But the reports coming out of Laos in late 1968 and early 1969 were defying military logic. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, was one of the finest light infantry forces in the world. They knew the jungle, they owned the night. Yet, in the rugged highlands of Laos, they were losing. Entire battalions were being routed by an enemy that refused to fight a conventional war. When the NVA brought up heavy artillery, the enemy disappeared into the caves. When the NVA advanced into the valleys, they found themselves walking into kill zones prepared weeks in advance. Bridges were blown hours before convoys arrived. Munitions depots, hidden deep in the jungle canopy, were pinpointed and destroyed with impossible accuracy. For the Soviet attaches monitoring the situation, the tactical assessment didn't add up. The local population in these highlands were Hmong tribesmen. In the eyes of the Soviet planners, these were subsistence farmers who lived in bamboo huts and practiced slash-and-burn agriculture. The idea that these scattered tribes could organize a coordinated defense against a modern, Soviet-equipped army was laughable. It was racist arrogance, but it was also the prevailing military doctrine. Peasants didn't stop tanks. But the casualty reports were real. The burning trucks were real. Intelligence officers began to intercept strange radio traffic. It wasn't English, but it wasn't Lao or Vietnamese either. It was a dialect the intercept officers in Hanoi struggled to translate. Mixed in with the tribal language were code words, call signs for air support. This was the first major clue. The primitive enemy had air power, but where was it coming from? The US Air Force was bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, yes, but those were high-altitude B-52 strikes or fast-moving jets hitting coordinates. This was different. The soldiers surviving the ambushes reported propeller-driven aircraft, ancient 28 Trojans flying dangerously low, weaving between the canyon walls, dropping napalm with surgical precision to support the ground troops. Who was flying these planes? The Americans didn't use 28s anymore. The Royal Lao Air Force was virtually non-existent and barely left the capital of Vientiane. A dark realization began to settle over the Soviet and North Vietnamese command. They weren't fighting a scattered insurgency. They were fighting a ghost army, an organized, supplied and air-supported military force that existed nowhere on paper. In Moscow, the GRU Soviet military intelligence demanded answers. If the Americans had deployed a secret division into Laos, it would be a massive escalation of the Cold War. It would violate international treaties and could trigger a direct superpower confrontation. They needed proof. They needed to find the headquarters of this phantom force. They turned their attention to a location on the map that was officially designated as a Valley of Nothing, a place surrounded by vertical limestone walls, inaccessible by road, and perpetually covered in cloud. The locals called it the Valley of the Jars. But on the classified American charts that the Soviets had yet to see, it was simply known as Long Tieng. To the world, Long Tieng did not exist. To the NVA soldiers dying in the tree line, it was the source of their nightmares. The enemy was about to find out that they had walked into a trap set not by a general, but by a ghost. Mid-1969. North Vietnamese intelligence headquarters, Hanoi. The room was filled with cigarette smoke and the hum of ceiling fans trying to cut through the humid tropical air. On the table lay a series of grainy, black and white aerial reconnaissance photographs. A Soviet KGB liaison officer leaned over the shoulder of a senior North Vietnamese strategist. They were looking at a ghost. The coordinates pointed to a valley deep within the Annamite Mountains, a place surrounded on three sides by limestone cliffs that shot up vertically like fortress walls. On every official map in the room, French, American and Soviet, this location was marked as uninhabited jungle. It was a blank space, a void. But the photographs showed a bustling metropolis. "Explain this to me," the Soviet liaison said, his voice low. "How do you hide a city of 30,000 people?" The photo showed a paved runway. It wasn't a crude dirt strip cut for emergencies. It was a fully operational airfield, tarmac black and fresh. Around it were clusters of corrugated tin roofs, radio antennas, warehouses and barracks. There were markets. There were schools. This was Long Tieng. To the few Americans in the know, it was Lima Site 20A. To the Hmong, it was simply sky. And in 1969, this secret city, which did not officially exist, had become the second largest city in Laos, surpassed only by the capital, Vientiane. But what truly baffled the communist intelligence officers wasn't the buildings, it was the air traffic. Intercepted radar data suggested that this hidden valley was, at certain hours of the day, the busiest airport in the world. It was busier than O'Hare in Chicago, busier than Heathrow in London. A plane was taking off or landing every 20 seconds. "What are they carrying?" the strategist asked. The reports from the field were nonsensical. NVA scouts hiding in the tree line near the drop zones reported seeing planes dropping sacks of rice, live pigs, and medical supplies. But mixed in with the humanitarian aid were pallets of heavy munitions, crates of rifles, and drums of aviation fuel. And the pilots? They were an even bigger mystery. Soviet intelligence had been tracking the radio chatter. They expected to hear the disciplined, formal call signs of the United States Air Force. Instead, they heard cowboys. The voices on the radio were casual, cracking jokes, complaining about the weather or the beer supply. They didn't use military ranks. They used call signs like Zorro, Mr. Clean, and Butterfly. These weren't soldiers. They were civilians. They were flying for companies with innocuous names like Air America and Continental Air Services. They flew unarmed transport planes, C-46 Commandos and C-123, providers into anti-aircraft fire that would terrify a fighter pilot. They landed on mountain strips so short and steep that the planes had to stall just to stop from crashing into the cliff face. The Soviets realized they were facing a privatization of war on a scale never seen before. The Americans had outsourced the logistics of an entire front to a fleet of mercenaries and adventurers, creating a supply chain that was immune to political oversight because, officially, it wasn't happening. But a supply chain needs an army to supply, and that army was the source of the NVA's growing dread. Down on the ground, the war for the Plain of Jars was turning into a meat grinder. The North Vietnamese army was used to fighting Americans. Americans were loud. They smelled of tobacco and insect repellent. They moved in heavy columns and relied on massive firepower. You could hear them coming from miles away. The enemy in Laos was silent. The NVA soldiers began to whisper the name of the man leading the Ghost Army. They called him the Tiger. His name was Vang Pao. Vang Pao was a Hmong major general, a former sergeant in the French colonial army who possessed a magnetic, almost spiritual hold over his people. To the Soviets, he was a bandit leader. But the battlefield reports painted a picture of a military genius. Vang Pao didn't fight for territory, he fought for survival. He knew that if the communists took Laos, the Hmong people would be wiped out. He turned the geography of Laos against the invaders. In late 1969, the NVA launched a massive offensive to retake the Plain of Jars. They brought in their heavy armor, Soviet-made PT-76 tanks and 130mm field guns. They expected to roll over the primitive hill tribes. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. As the NVA columns advanced through the tall elephant grass, the ground beneath them seemed to explode. Vang Pao's troops, guided by the mysterious civilians in the sky, had pre-sighted every inch of the valley. But the most terrifying weapon wasn't the artillery, it was the ravens. The NVA troops learned to fear the sight of a small, slow-moving Cessna 1 bird dog circling lazily overhead. These were the forward air controllers. The men inside these tiny planes weren't just observing, they were the conductors of a symphony of destruction. A Soviet after-action report described an engagement near the village of Xieng Kuang. A battalion of North Vietnamese regulars was pinned down. They looked up and saw a bird dog dive, firing a white phosphorus rocket to mark their position. Moments later, the sky tore open. But it wasn't a standard bombing run. 2 American 4 Phantoms appeared out of nowhere, guided by the voice in the little Cessna. They dropped their payload within 50 meters of the Hmong positions, a feat of accuracy that required nerves of steel from both the pilots and the ground troops. The NVA battalion was decimated. The survivors retreated, leaving their heavy weapons behind. Back in Hanoi, the mood shifted from confusion to fury. The secret war was no longer a sideshow, it was a humiliating stalemate. A ragtag army of indigenous mountain people, led by a warlord and supplied by a commercial airline, was holding off the disciplined might of the communist bloc. The Soviet advisors realized that as long as Long Tieng existed, they could not win in Laos. The valley was the heart, it was the brain, and it had to be destroyed. The order came down from the highest levels of the North Vietnamese Politburo, stamped with the approval of their Soviet backers: find the road to Long Tieng, burn it to the ground. They began to assemble a force unlike anything seen in the Laotian theater, Campaign Z. It would involve tens of thousands of regulars, heavy artillery, and the latest Soviet anti-aircraft missiles. They were going to simply overwhelm the geography with steel. But as the NVA prepared their hammer blow, the secret army was preparing a surprise of its own. The Americans and Vang Pao knew they couldn't win a conventional slugfest. They were outnumbered 10-1. If they stood and fought, they would die. So, they decided to do something that defied the laws of physics and military sanity. They were going to move the mountain. December 1971, the Ridge of Death. The war had changed. The silence of the jungle was gone, replaced by a sound that made the ground shake in the secret valley of Long Tieng. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy hammer hitting the earth miles away. To the untrained ear, it was just thunder. To the CIA case officers and Vang Pao's veterans, it was the sound of doom. It was the Soviet M46, a 130mm field gun. This was the twist the Americans hadn't planned for. For years, the geography of limestone karsts had protected the secret city. The mountains were too steep for tanks, and the jungle was too thick for heavy artillery. The NVA had been forced to rely on mortars and light rockets, which lacked the range to hit the airstrip from the safety of the northern hills. But the North Vietnamese engineers, under the guidance of Soviet logistics experts, had done the impossible. In a feat rivaling the construction of the pyramids, they had built a road through the solid rock of the mountains. They had dragged these massive, long-range cannons through mud and monsoon rain, inch by inch, until they were within range of the valley. On New Year's Eve, the first shell screamed over the limestone peaks. It slammed into the runway at Long Tieng, shattering the illusion of invulnerability. Then came another, and another. The secret city was no longer a sanctuary, it was a fishbowl, and the NVA was smashing the glass. In Hanoi, the mood was triumphant. The Soviet military attaches watched the maps update in real time. The NVA had launched Campaign Z, a massive, coordinated offensive designed to wipe the Hmong resistance off the face of the earth. They had the numbers 3 full divisions, nearly 20,000 men. They had the firepower tanks, heavy artillery, and anti-aircraft missiles. Against them stood a ragged force of exhausted Hmong guerrillas and a handful of CIA paramilitary officers. The math was simple. It was over. But as the shelling intensified, something strange happened on the radar screens of the NVA commanders. They expected a rout. They expected the Hmong to scatter into the jungle, as they always did when outgunned. They expected the Americans to cut their losses and evacuate. Instead, the resistance stiffened. The battle centered on a single geographic feature, Skyline Ridge. This was a jagged, razorback mountain wall that loomed directly over the Long Tieng Valley. If the NVA took the ridge, they could look down into the secret city and slaughter everyone inside with direct rifle fire. It was the last line of defense. The NVA assault waves charged up the northern slope of the ridge. They were met not just by Hmong soldiers, but by a new, mysterious force. These men were taller, better equipped, and fought with a professional discipline that surprised the communist regulars. They were the Thai Unity Forces mercenaries recruited by the CIA from the Thai military, flown in secretly to bolster the line. The secret war had just become a multinational conflict. The fighting on Skyline Ridge descended into primal brutality. It was hand-to-hand combat at 4,000 feet. The NVA would take a bunker, and the Hmong and Thai forces would retake it an hour later with grenades and knives. But the NVA had a trump card: tanks. For the first time in the history of the Laotian War, the NVA managed to drive 34 and PT-76 tanks into the jagged highlands. The sight of armor rolling through the morning mist was terrifying. The Hmong had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping them. The Soviet advisors monitoring the radio traffic heard the panic in the defenders' voices. "Tanks! Tanks on the perimeter!" This was the checkmate. Infantry could not stop armor. The NVA commanders ordered a general advance, preparing to sweep over the ridge and pour into the valley below. They prepared their victory cables for Moscow. Long Tieng has fallen. The American operation is destroyed. Then, the sky began to buzz. It wasn't the roar of jets. It was that slow, distinctive drone of the Ravens again. The CIA and the Hmong didn't have tanks, but they had the airborne artillery. In a display of piloting that defied aviation safety standards, American pilots in Aoni Skyraider's bulky, propeller-driven planes from the 1940s began to fly below the level of the ridgeline. They were flying in the trough, the narrow valleys between the peaks. They came in so low that NVA soldiers on the ridge could see the pilots' faces. The Skyraiders weren't dropping bombs. They were strafing. Their 20mm cannons tore through the jungle canopy. But the NVA kept coming. They were relentless. By mid-January 1972, the situation was critical. The NVA had breached the outer defenses. They were on the crest of Skyline Ridge. They were looking down at the CIA base. Inside the valley, it was controlled chaos. The CIA case officers were burning files in 55-gallon drums. The legendary Air America helicopters were flying non-stop, evacuating the wounded. The smoke from the burning documents mixed with the smoke of exploding artillery shells. The Soviet plan was working. They had forced the Americans into a corner from which there was no escape. The secret army was trapped in its own fortress. And then, just as the final assault was about to begin, the CIA played a card that the Soviets never saw coming. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a plane, it was a bluff of massive proportions. The NVA intercepted a message. The Americans were pulling out. The resistance was collapsing. The NVA commanders paused, sensing victory, and decided to regroup for one final, clean sweep to minimize their own casualties. They halted the tanks to refuel. They stopped the artillery barrages to let the smoke clear. They gave the secret army exactly what it needed: time. In the silence of that pause, the Americans weren't leaving. They were reloading, and they were about to turn the geography of the trap inside out. February 1972, the Skyline Ridge. The pause in the fighting had lasted for 6 hours. To the North Vietnamese commanders sitting in their bunkers on the captured heights of Skyline Ridge, this silence smelled like victory. They watched through binoculars as the last of the transport planes lifted off from the Long Tieng runway below. They believed the Americans were fleeing. They believed the secret army was broken. The Soviet advisors attached to the NVA artillery regiments were already drafting their reports to Moscow. They had proven that superior Soviet heavy weaponry, the 130mm guns and the 34 tanks, could crush the irregular tactics of the CIA. The School of the Jungle had been defeated by the School of Steel. But they had miscalculated. The planes leaving Long Tieng weren't evacuating the base, they were clearing the airspace. At 30,000 feet, far above the cloud layer, invisible to the naked eye, and silent to the ears of the soldiers on the ground, a flight of giants was approaching. They had taken off hours earlier from Utapao Air Base in Thailand or Guam. They were Boeing B-52 Stratofortresses. These were strategic nuclear bombers. They were designed to destroy cities, to level industrial complexes, and to fight World War III. They were never, ever supposed to be used for close air support. Using a strategic bomber to hit a target just a few hundred meters away from your own friendly troops was considered madness. The margin for error was non-existent. A single calculation error would wipe out the CIA base and the Hmong defenders instantly. But Vang Pao and his CIA handlers had no other cards left to play. They called in arc light. The Soviet advisor on the ridge was the first to sense the change. The air pressure seemed to drop. The birds in the jungle, which had been screeching all morning, suddenly went silent. Then came the sound. It wasn't an explosion. It was a tearing noise, like the sky itself was being ripped in half. For the NVA soldiers entrenched on the ridge, the world simply ended. A box of destruction, 1 kilometer long and half a kilometer wide, was instantly vaporized. The B-52 strikes didn't just kill, they erased. The bombs fell in a precise, overlapping pattern that turned the limestone mountain into dust. The ground shook with such violence that seismographs in Vientiane, 100 miles away, registered it as an earthquake. The concussion waves collapsed the NVA tunnels. The overpressure liquefied organs. The 34 tanks were flipped over like children's toys. Down in the valley, the CIA officers and Hmong defenders crouched in their bunkers, their teeth rattling in their skulls. They watched as the ridgeline, which had been swarming with enemy troops moments before, disappeared behind a wall of grey dust and orange fire. When the dust settled, the geography of the battlefield had changed. The dense jungle was gone. The bunkers were gone. The victorious North Vietnamese army was gone. This was the shock that stunned the Soviet generals. It wasn't just the firepower, it was the integration. The Soviets realized with horror that the CIA had achieved a level of warfare they could not replicate. The Americans had connected a ragged guerrilla fighter on the ground, holding a radio, directly to a strategic bomber fleet capable of leveling a mountain. The primitive Hmong army had the most powerful artillery support in the history of human warfare. But the B-52s were only the hammer. The anvil was even more shocking. As the smoke cleared, the NVA survivors, shell-shocked, deaf and disoriented, tried to regroup. They expected the Hmong to be cowering in the valley. Instead, they found themselves surrounded. While the B-52s were hammering the ridge, the Air America fleet, the civilians, had pulled off a logistical miracle. Using their fleets of helicopters, they had airlifted thousands of fresh Hmong troops behind the NVA lines. This was the secret of the secret army. They were the most mobile infantry force on Earth. A Hmong soldier could fight a battle in the morning, be picked up by a helicopter at noon, eat a hot meal at a remote outpost, and be dropped onto a mountain peak 20 miles away by 2 p.m. to ambush the retreating enemy. The NVA, relying on trucks and footpaths, were moving at the speed of the 19th century. The Hmong were moving at the speed of the rotor blade. The Soviet assessment of the battle changed from imminent victory to catastrophic failure. The NVA offensive collapsed. The survivors retreated back into the mist, leaving their precious heavy artillery behind to rust in the jungle. Long Tieng had held. As 1972 turned into 1973, the secret war reached a terrifying stalemate. The Soviets and North Vietnamese poured more resources into the fight, determined to crush this anomaly. The Americans poured in more air power. The statistics of this secret conflict, once declassified, revealed a scale of destruction that is almost impossible to comprehend. To keep the secret army alive and to stop the communist advance, the United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. That is equal to a plane load of bombs being dropped every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years. Laos became, per capita, the most heavily bombed nation in history, and yet the world knew almost nothing about it. For the Soviet generals, the lesson of Laos was a bitter one. They had learned that in the Cold War, superior numbers and tanks were not enough. They had been stopped by a shadow force, a coalition of indigenous warriors and intelligence officers who utilized terrain, technology, and sheer audacity to hold back the tide. However, the story does not end with a parade. There was no victory day. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The United States began its withdrawal from Vietnam. The funding for the secret war began to dry up. The CIA case officers, men who had fought alongside the Hmong for a decade, who had attended their weddings and buried their children, received the order they had dreaded: pack up. The betrayal was slow, then sudden. By 1975, the writing was on the wall. Saigon fell in April. The Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese closed in on Long Tieng for the final time. But this time, there would be no B-52 strikes. There would be no miracle supply drops. The air bridge that had sustained the secret city was now running in reverse. On May 14, 1975, the final evacuation began. It was a scene of heartbreak that rivaled the fall of Saigon. General Vang Pao, the Tiger, stood on the runway at Long Tieng. Thousands of his people, soldiers, wives, children, gathered around the barbed wire, begging for a seat on the last planes. They knew what was coming. The communists had declared they would wipe out the Hmong for their loyalty to the Americans. Only a few thousand could be saved. The CIA pilots, tears streaming down their faces, overloaded their planes, taking off with people clinging to the cargo ramps. As the last C-46 lifted into the overcast sky, leaving thousands behind on the tarmac, the secret war ended. The NVA walked into Long Tieng a few days later. They found a ghost town. The buildings were stripped. The files were burned. The only thing left was the silence of the limestone casts, standing watch over a valley that had seen too much. So, why were the Soviet generals stunned? They were stunned because they had witnessed a new model of warfare. They saw how a superpower could project force without officially deploying a single soldier. They saw how a local population, when armed and supported by a massive logistical machine, could bleed a conventional army dry. The secret army in Laos did exactly what it was designed to do. It disrupted the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It tied down tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops who otherwise would have been fighting Americans in South Vietnam, and it prevented Laos from falling to communism for over a decade against impossible odds. But the cost was paid by the Hmong. Today, if you travel to the plain of Jars, you can still see the craters. They are grassy depressions in the earth, ponds where ducks swim, scars that have healed over but never disappeared. The metal from the millions of bombs has been harvested by the locals, turned into spoons, fences and souvenirs. The secret city of Long Tieng remained a closed military zone for decades, a place that officially didn't exist, guarding the secrets of a war that was never declared. It stands as a testament to the strangest chapter of the Cold War, a time when a few hundred spies and a tribe of mountain warriors managed to stop the march of an empire, and for a brief moment made the impossible happen in the jungle.